A bullet's whistle breaks the dawn silence. Metal piercing metal. The president's armored limousine shudders under impact as Secret Service agents swarm like angry hornets, weapons drawn against unseen enemies. The old mechanic lies face down on Virginia asphalt, blood seeping through his bandaged shoulder, thinking how strange that redemption should look like this, tackled to the ground while trying to save a country that forgot him decades ago. Some debts can never be paid. Some truths refuse to stay buried, especially those written in the medical charts of dying veterans and cancer-stricken children in forgotten Black communities across America. They say time heals all wounds. They're wrong. Some wounds fester in the shadows of power, protected by men in expensive suits who decide which lives matter and which are merely statistical footnotes. But even the most carefully guarded secrets have a breaking point, and sometimes that point begins with nothing more than a bowl of homemade soup on a stormy night. The Montana winter never apologized for its cruelty. Robert Bobby Harmon had learned that lesson decades ago when he first retreated to this remote corner of the state, a place where the thermometer rarely climbed above freezing from November through March, and where snowdrifts could swallow a man whole if he wasn't careful. At 68, Bobby's weathered face told the story of a man who had seen too much of both the heavens and earth. Deep lines carved pathways from the corners of his eyes that had once peered through the viewfinders of spacecraft designs that changed history. His calloused hands, now stained with engine grease, had once calibrated instruments bound for the stars. "Come on, you stubborn piece of," he muttered, wrestling with a frozen bolt on the undercarriage of Mrs. Wheaton's ancient Ford pickup. The space heater beside him barely dented the cold that had settled into his workshop like an unwelcome tenant. Outside, twilight was approaching, bringing with it the promise of temperatures that would make even wolves seek shelter. Harmon's auto repair sat at the end of a winding county road, the last outpost of civilization before 20 miles of wilderness that stretched to the Canadian border. The converted barn with its rusted sign had been Bobby's home and livelihood for 25 years, ever since NASA and the aerospace industry had decided Robert Harmon was a liability they couldn't afford. He still remembered the day it all came crashing down. April 17, 1983. He'd submitted his report on the O-ring design flaw, warning of catastrophic failure under certain temperature conditions. The contractor had buried it. His superiors had dismissed it. When he persisted, words like difficult and not a team player began appearing in his file. Bobby had been right, of course, but being right didn't matter when billions in defense contracts were at stake. 3 years later, when tragedy struck and 7 lives were lost in a ball of flame that the whole world witnessed, nobody remembered the engineer who had tried to prevent it. By then, he had already been blacklisted, divorced, and erased from the industry he had once helped define. The bolt finally gave way with a satisfying crack, allowing Bobby to remove the damaged heat shield. As he worked, the radio on his workbench crackled with news about the worsening financial crisis. Something about banks packaging bad mortgages, investment firms collapsing, and retirement accounts evaporating overnight. Bobby grunted. The world of high finance seemed as distant to him now as the moon missions he had once helped design. He was tightening the last screw on Mrs. Wheaton's new heat shield when headlights swept across the workshop windows. Bobby frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone else today, and strangers rarely found their way to his door, especially in weather like this. The vehicle, a sleek black Mercedes sedan that looked absurdly out of place against the snow-covered landscape, rolled to a stop outside. Its engine cut off, but for several long moments, no one emerged. Bobby set down his wrench and reached for the old flannel shirt hanging on a hook, wiping his hands as he moved toward the door. Just as he reached for the handle, the car door opened. A woman stepped out, immediately sinking ankle-deep in snow. She wore an expensive-looking coat that was wholly inadequate for Montana winter, and stylish leather boots that would be ruined by morning. Her silver-streaked dark hair whipped around her face in the bitter wind as she struggled toward the workshop, one hand clutching a sleek leather briefcase, the other holding her coat closed at the throat. Bobby pushed open the door. "You're a long way from wherever you're supposed to be, ma'am." The woman's head snapped up, her eyes sharp and intelligent, assessing him in an instant. She was perhaps in her mid-50s, with the poised demeanor of someone accustomed to boardrooms rather than repair shops. "My car," she managed through chattering teeth. "Something's wrong with the engine. Started making a terrible noise about 5 miles back, then just died." Bobby glanced at the Mercedes. Even from here, he could see the steam rising from under its hood, never a good sign, especially in temperatures cold enough to freeze that steam into delicate ice crystals before it dissipated. "Get inside before you freeze," he said, stepping back to let her enter the relative warmth of his workshop. "I'll take a look, but I can't promise I'll have the parts for something like that." "Thank you." She hurried past him, making a beeline for the space heater. As she warmed her hands, Bobby noticed a subtle tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes darted to the windows every few seconds. "Name's Bobby Harmon," he offered, moving toward a cabinet where he kept coffee supplies. "This isn't exactly AAA territory. You're lucky you broke down near something resembling civilization." "Catherine Reynolds," she replied, her posture relaxing fractionally. "Kate, and yes, I'm beginning to realize that I didn't expect to be on these back roads. My GPS was supposed to be taking me to Great Falls." Bobby snorted as he spooned instant coffee into 2 chipped mugs. "GPS doesn't know these roads in winter. Half of them disappear under snow. You're about 80 miles northwest of where you think you are." He poured hot water from an electric kettle and handed her a mug. Kate accepted it gratefully, her manicured hands wrapping around the ceramic as if it were a lifeline. "I'll check your car," Bobby said, reaching for his heavy coat. "Drink that. There's more if you want it." Outside, the temperature had dropped another 5 degrees. Bobby's breath formed thick clouds as he trudged through the snow to the Mercedes. The hood was still warm to the touch despite the frigid air. He propped it open and grimaced at what he saw. The radiator had cracked, likely from the extreme cold, and coolant had sprayed across the immaculate engine compartment before freezing in grotesque patterns. Working quickly with a flashlight clenched between his teeth, Bobby inspected the damage. This wasn't a quick fix. The radiator would need replacement, and he'd bet good money that there wasn't a Mercedes dealership within 200 miles that stocked the part. Even if there was, the roads would be impassable until the county plows made their rounds tomorrow, if they made it out this far at all. When he returned to the workshop, stamping snow from his boots, Kate had set her briefcase on the workbench and was pacing in small circles, phone in hand. "No signal," Bobby confirmed before she could ask. "Landline works most days, but the storm knocked it out this morning. Should be back tomorrow." Kate's expression tightened. "I need to be in Washington by Friday." "That's not happening in your car," Bobby said bluntly, hanging up his coat. "Radiator's cracked. Coolant's gone. Even if I could get the part, which I can't, these roads won't be clear for at least a day, maybe 2. Kate closed her eyes briefly, and Bobby caught a glimpse of something that looked like fear before she masked it with determination. "Is there a hotel nearby somewhere I could wait until—" "Nearest motel is in Whitefish, 40 miles south," Bobby interrupted. "But you won't get there tonight. Not in this." He gestured toward the window, where snow had begun to fall again, fat flakes swirling in the glow of the outdoor security light. Kate's shoulders slumped slightly. "I see." Bobby scratched his beard, considering. The woman was clearly out of her element, but something about her put him on edge the way she kept glancing at the door, the tight grip she maintained on her briefcase, the fact that she was driving a luxury car on back roads in the dead of winter. Still, he couldn't send her back out there to freeze. "There's a cot in the back room," he said finally. "Not much, but it's warm. You can stay the night, and we'll figure something out in the morning." Relief flickered across Kate's face. "Thank you. I appreciate that more than you know." Bobby nodded toward her briefcase. "You might want to bring whatever valuables you have from the car. These woods are pretty safe, but no sense taking chances." Kate clutched the briefcase tighter. "I have everything I need right here." Something in her tone made Bobby pause, but he didn't press. Everyone had their secrets, and he'd learned long ago that minding his own business was the best policy in these parts. He showed her to the small room at the back of the workshop where he sometimes slept when working late, or when the weather made the 100-yard trek to his cabin seem too daunting. It was Spartan, a military-style cot, a small dresser, a reading lamp, but it was clean and insulated. "Bathroom's through there," he said, pointing to a narrow door. "It's not fancy, but the water's hot. There's extra blankets in the bottom drawer if you need them." Kate set her briefcase on the cot. "This is fine. Thank you." Bobby lingered in the doorway for a moment. "I'll be in the workshop for another hour or so, finishing up a job. Then I'll head to my cabin. It's just behind the shop if you need anything." Kate nodded, her gaze already fixed on the window, where darkness had fully descended, transforming the glass into a black mirror that reflected her troubled expression back at her. Bobby returned to Mrs. Wheaton's truck, but found himself unable to focus. There was something off about Catherine Reynolds, something that nagged at the edge of his consciousness like a splinter under skin. Maybe it was the way she'd appeared out of nowhere, on one of the worst nights of the winter. Maybe it was the contradiction between her polished appearance and her apparent determination to drive through remote backroads. Or maybe it was simply that Bobby Harmon had spent too many years alone, his natural suspicion of others calcifying into something harder. He was tightening the last bolt when he heard the creak of floorboards. Kate stood in the doorway of the back room, watching him with an unreadable expression. "I thought you might be hungry," Bobby said, straightening up with a wince as his back protested. "I was going to heat up some soup." Kate stepped further into the workshop. "Mr. Harmon, I haven't been entirely honest with you." Bobby set down his wrench, instinctively creating distance between them. "Is that right?" She took a deep breath. "My name is Catherine Reynolds. That part is true, but I didn't take a wrong turn because of a faulty GPS. I'm running from some very dangerous people, and I'm afraid I may have led them straight to your door." Before Bobby could respond, headlights swept across the workshop windows, not just one pair, but several, moving in formation. The sound of engines, powerful and purposeful, cut through the howling wind. "They're here," Kate whispered, her face draining of color. "God, they found me already." Bobby moved to the window, peering through a gap in the blinds. 3 black SUVs had pulled into the yard, forming a semicircle around the entrance to the workshop. Men in dark clothing were emerging, their movements precise and coordinated. Several carried what looked like assault rifles. "Friends of yours?" Bobby asked, his voice dry despite the surge of adrenaline. "Security team from Pinnacle Financial Group," Kate replied, backing toward her room. I was their chief compliance officer until yesterday, when I discovered they've been laundering billions through offshore accounts, much of it tied to terrorist organizations." Bobby's eyebrows shot up. "And you decided to what? Take a road trip?" "I took evidence," Kate said, patting her briefcase. "Enough to bring down half the executive board. I was trying to reach a former colleague in Washington who can help me get it to the right authorities." A sharp rap on the workshop door interrupted them. "Mr. Harmon," a voice called out. "My name is Victor Crane, head of security for Pinnacle Financial. We'd like a word." Bobby glanced at Kate, who had gone rigid with fear. Something in her expression, a mixture of desperation and determination, triggered a memory. He'd seen that same look in the mirror 25 years ago, when he'd stood alone against forces more powerful than himself. "Back room," he murmured. "Lock the door." Kate hesitated. "These men are professionals. Mr. Harmon, ex-military. Some of them. They won't just go away." "I've dealt with corporate thugs before," Bobby replied, reaching beneath the workbench. He pulled out an old shotgun, checking that it was loaded. "Go." Kate retreated to the back room as Bobby approached the door. He took a moment to compose himself, adjusting his posture to that of a confused old mechanic disturbed in his work. Then he cracked the door open just enough to see out. "Can I help you?" he asked, and keeping the shotgun out of sight. The man at the door was tall and broad-shouldered, with the rigid posture of someone who had spent time in uniform. His closely cropped hair and cold eyes completed the image of a man accustomed to intimidation. "Victor Crane," the man repeated, offering a business card that Bobby didn't take. "We're looking for Catherine Reynolds. Her car was reported in this area, and we noticed it parked outside." "Lady with the fancy Mercedes?" Bobby asked, feigning ignorance. "Yeah, she broke down. Radiator shot. I told her to hole up in Whitefish for the night while I order parts." Victor's eyes narrowed slightly. "When did she leave?" "Couple hours ago. Called a cab from Whitefish to come get her." Bobby shrugged. "Cost her a fortune, I bet, but she seemed in a hurry." Victor studied Bobby's face for a long moment. "Mind if we take a look around, Ms. Reynolds may have left something important in her vehicle." "Suit yourself," Bobby said, stepping back to allow Victor inside. "But there's nothing in that car except a busted radiator and some frozen coolant." Victor entered, followed by two men whose jackets couldn't quite conceal the holsters beneath them. They swept the workshop with practiced efficiency, their gazes lingering on the door to the back room. "What's through there?" Victor asked casually. "Storage," Bobby replied. "Parts, mostly. Some personal stuff." Victor nodded to one of his men, who moved toward the door. Bobby stepped sideways, blocking his path. "Look, I don't mean to be rude, but I've got work to finish. You want to check the lady's car? Go ahead. But my private storage isn't part of the deal." The tension in the room ratcheted up several notches. The second man had shifted his position, hand drifting toward his concealed weapon. Victor's expression remained neutral, but his eyes had hardened to flint. "Mr. Harmon," he said softly, "I don't think you understand the situation. Catherine Reynolds has stolen proprietary information from Pinnacle Financial Group, information that could damage our reputation and that of our clients. We simply want to recover it and ensure it doesn't fall into the wrong hands." Bobby leaned on his shotgun like it was a walking stick. "Sounds like a matter for the police, not private security." "We're handling this internally for now," Victor replied. "To avoid unnecessary scandal." "Well, like I said, she's not here," Bobby insisted. "Called a cab and headed to Whitefish." The standoff might have continued indefinitely if not for the soft thud that came from the back room, the sound of something being knocked over. Perhaps a book or a cup. Victor's head snapped toward the noise, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "Search it," he ordered. The men moved toward the back room, drawing their weapons. Bobby raised the shotgun, pointing it at Victor's chest. "That's far enough," he said, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. Victor looked almost amused. "You're making a serious mistake. Old man, put the gun down before someone gets hurt." "Last I checked, this is still my property," Bobby replied, "and you boys are trespassing. So unless you've got a warrant or a badge, I suggest you leave." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Victor reached slowly into his jacket, producing not a gun but a phone. "Let's not escalate this unnecessarily. I'm going to make a call, and then we can resolve this situation peacefully." Bobby kept the shotgun trained on Victor's chest, but a cold certainty was settling in his gut. These men weren't going to leave empty-handed, and if Victor made that call, more would come. The odds, already poor, would become impossible. The decision crystallized in his mind with surprising clarity. Maybe it was the echo of his past the moment he'd failed to stand firm, to fight harder for what he knew was right. Or maybe it was simply that Bobby Harmon had spent 25 years in exile, and somewhere deep inside, he'd been waiting for a chance at redemption. He fired the shotgun, not at Victor but at the ceiling above him. The blast shattered the overhead light, plunging the workshop into sudden darkness except for the emergency lights that kicked on automatically. In the confusion, Bobby swung the butt of the shotgun at Victor, catching him in the temple. The security chief crumpled to the floor. The other men reacted instantly, firing toward the sound. Bullets splintered wood and ricocheted off metal as Bobby dove behind a heavy tool cabinet. He reached up to a shelf, fingers finding a small remote control. When he pressed the button, A deafening siren wailed to life, its disorienting pulse designed to confuse intruders, a security system left over from Bobby's more paranoid days. In the chaos, he crawled toward the back room, staying low as more shots rang out. He reached the door and shouldered it open, finding Kate pressed against the far wall, clutching her briefcase. "This way!" he shouted over the siren, moving to a heavy storage shelf. With a grunt, he pulled it aside, revealing a narrow passageway. "Underground tunnel. Goes to the cabin. Move!" Kate didn't hesitate, ducking into the passage. Bobby followed, pulling the shelf back into place behind them. The passage was tight and dark, illuminated only by emergency lights that cast everything in a sickly red glow. "Why do you have a secret tunnel under your workshop?" Kate gasped as they half ran, half crawled through the cramped space. "Cold War paranoia," Bobby replied tersely. "Previous owner was convinced the Russians were coming. I kept it maintained. Never thought I'd actually use it." They emerged in a small root cellar beneath Bobby's cabin. He led Kate up a ladder and through a trap door into the kitchen, where he immediately began gathering supplies. "We've got maybe 5 minutes before they figure out where we went," he said, stuffing canned food and a first aid kit into a backpack. "Grab that flashlight and the maps on the table." Kate complied, moving with the efficiency of someone accustomed to crisis management. "Where are we going?" "There's an old logging road about a mile east," Bobby said, pulling a heavy winter coat from a hook and tossing it to her. "Put this on. Your fancy city coat won't cut it out there." He moved to a locked cabinet in the corner, entering a combination with practiced ease. Inside was an impressive collection of firearms and ammunition, along with several passports and stacks of cash. "You were expecting something like this?" Kate asked, eyeing the arsenal. Bobby loaded a pistol and tucked it into his waistband. "Let's just say I learned the hard way that it pays to be prepared." He handed her a smaller handgun. "You know how to use this?" Kate checked the chamber with surprising competence. "Corporate security training. I never thought I'd need it." Bobby nodded, impressed despite himself. He slung the backpack over his shoulder and grabbed a rifle from the cabinet. "There's a snowmobile in the shed out back. It's our best shot at putting some distance between us and them before they organize a proper search." They slipped out the back door into the biting cold. The snow was falling harder now, reducing visibility to just a few yards. It would make tracking them more difficult, but it also increased the danger of the journey ahead. The shed was a simple structure, little more than a roof and walls to keep the weather off the equipment inside. Bobby threw open the door and wheeled out an old but well-maintained snowmobile. "It's not pretty, but it's reliable," he said, checking the fuel gauge. "Should get us to the highway if we're careful." A shout from the direction of the workshop cut through the howling wind. Bobby cursed under his breath. "They're faster than I thought. Get on. Hold tight." Kate climbed onto the seat behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist. The engine roared to life, momentarily drowning out all other sounds. Then they were moving, cutting through the snow like a knife, the wind stinging their faces despite the protection of their hoods. Bobby steered them into the tree line, where the pines would provide some cover. Behind them, flashlight beams swept across the yard as Victor's men emerged from the cabin. A few shots rang out, but they were already too far away to be easy targets, and the falling snow further obscured them from view. The snowmobile labored up a steep incline, its engine whining in protest. At the crest of the hill, Bobby paused to get his bearings. Below them, the lights of his property were just visible through the curtain of snow. Several more vehicles had arrived, their headlights cutting bright swaths through the darkness. "They're calling in reinforcements," Kate said, her voice muffled by the scarf she'd wrapped around her face. "Then we better not be here when they arrive," Bobby replied, gunning the engine again. They sped through the forest, following a path only Bobby could see. The ancient trees loomed around them like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with snow. For 20 minutes, they rode in tense silence, the only sounds the growl of the engine and the soft hiss of snow beneath the treads. Eventually, They broke through the trees onto a narrow, unplowed road, little more than a track, really, but it led away from Bobby's property and toward what he hoped might be safety. "Where are we going?" Kate asked, raising her voice to be heard over the engine and wind. "I've got a friend about 15 miles north," Bobby called back. "Howard Jenkins, ex-Air Force pilot. He's got a small airstrip on his property. If anyone can get us out of here, it's Howard." "You trust him?" Bobby considered the question. "As much as I trust anyone these days. We served together briefly before I moved to NASA. He's kept my secret so far." They followed the logging road for another 10 minutes before Bobby abruptly cut the engine, letting the snowmobile coast to a stop beneath a massive pine. He tilted his head, listening. Kate held her breath, straining to hear whatever had caught his attention. Then she heard it, the distant but unmistakable sound of engines, multiple vehicles moving fast. Bobby cursed softly. "They found the road faster than I expected," he muttered. "We need to move off trail." He restarted the engine and steered them into the trees, navigating by instinct through the maze of trunks and underbrush. The going was slower here, the snowmobile bucking and sliding over hidden obstacles. Kate clung to Bobby, her fingers digging into his coat as they narrowly missed a collision with a fallen log. The sound of pursuit grew louder, then suddenly cut off. Bobby slowed, listening again. "They're spreading out," he said grimly, "trying to flank us." He gunned the engine, pushing the snowmobile to its limits. They burst through a thicket of young pines, branches whipping at their faces, and emerged onto a frozen creek bed. Bobby followed it downstream, the smooth ice allowing them to pick up speed. A sharp crack split the air, followed by the whine of a bullet passing too close for comfort. Bobby zigzagged, making them a harder target, but their trail in the fresh snow was impossible to hide. Another shot, closer this time. Bobby felt the snowmobile shudder as a bullet struck somewhere in the engine compartment. Warning lights flashed on the simple dashboard, and the engine note changed, becoming rougher. "We're hit," he shouted. "Not going to make it much further." He spotted a narrow ravine up ahead and made for it, hoping the natural depression would provide some cover. The snowmobile was losing power rapidly, black smoke beginning to trail behind them. Just as they reached the edge of the ravine, the engine gave out completely. They abandoned the vehicle, sliding down the steep bank into the shelter of the ravine. Bobby unslung his rifle, scanning the tree line they had just left. Movement caught his eye, dark figures moving through the forest, converging on their position. "We need to split up," he said, making a quick decision. "They're after you in that briefcase. I'll draw them off. Give you a chance to reach Howard's place." Kate shook her head vehemently. "No, you've already risked too much. I won't leave you to face them alone." "This isn't a debate," Bobby snapped. "Follow the creek north for about 2 miles. You'll see a clearing with a windmill. That's Howard's property. Tell him Bobby sent you and that it's a Code Artemis situation. He'll know what to do." Kate hesitated, clearly torn. Another burst of gunfire decided the matter, bullets kicking up snow just yards from their position. "Go," Bobby urged, already moving in the opposite direction. "I'll find you at Howard's." With visible reluctance, Kate nodded and began making her way north, keeping low in the shelter of the ravine. Bobby watched her go, then turned his attention to creating a diversion. He fired 3 shots toward the figures moving through the trees, then broke cover, sprinting toward a dense thicket about 50 yards east. Shouts and gunfire followed him, confirming that at least some of their pursuers had taken the bait. Bobby was in remarkably good shape for a man pushing 70, but decades of Montana winters had taken their toll on his joints. His knee screamed in protest as he pushed himself up a snowy embankment, bullets cutting through the air around him. He rolled behind the massive trunk of a fallen pine, just as a round splintered the bark where his head had been moments before. Breathing hard, he checked his rifle and took stock of his situation. He could make out at least 4 figures moving through the trees toward his position. More would be following Kate. No doubt, but he'd drawn off enough to give her a fighting chance. Bobby lined up his sights on the nearest figure and squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed through the forest, and the figure dropped. Not dead, Bobby had aimed for the leg, but definitely out of the fight. The others immediately took cover, returning fire with much less accuracy. A plan formed in Bobby's mind. If he could lead these men on a chase away from Kate's route to Howard's, she might make it. And if she did, there was still a chance that evidence in her briefcase would see the light of day. He fired again, deliberately missing this time, then scrambled to a new position about 20 yards away. The maneuver worked. His pursuers concentrated their fire on his previous hiding spot, giving him precious seconds to put more distance between them. For the next 30 minutes, Bobby played a deadly game of cat and mouse through the snowy forest. He would fire, relocate, then repeat, gradually drawing Victor's men farther from Kate's escape route. His old bones protested the exertion, but adrenaline kept him moving. Eventually, he found himself backed against a steep cliff face with nowhere left to run. His ammunition was nearly spent, and he could hear his pursuers closing in, communicating via radio as they tightened the noose. Bobby wedged himself into a narrow crevice in the rock. Rifle at the ready, he would make his last stand here, buying as much time as possible for Kate. A strange calm settled over him. After 25 years of exile, of feeling like his life had been stolen from him, there was a certain satisfaction in choosing his own fate. The first figure emerged from the trees about 30 yards away. Not one of Victor's security team, but Victor himself, his temple sporting an ugly bruise where Bobby had struck him. He held a pistol in a two-handed grip, moving with the confidence of someone accustomed to violence. "I know you're there. Harmon?" Victor called out, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "There's nowhere left to run." Bobby remained silent, controlling his breathing as he'd been taught during his brief military service. Victor advanced cautiously, eyes scanning the cliff face. "I've got to admit, you're not what I expected," Victor continued. "An old mechanic giving my best men this much trouble, impressive. But it ends now." He was 20 yards away now, close enough that Bobby could see the cold calculation in his eyes. Behind him, 3 more men emerged from the trees, weapons raised. "Last chance. Harmon, tell me where Catherine Reynolds is, and you might walk away from this." Bobby knew a lie when he heard one. Men like Victor didn't leave witnesses. "Go to hell," Bobby replied, rising from his hiding place. In one fluid motion, he brought the rifle to his shoulder and fired at the nearest of Victor's men. The shot caught the man in the shoulder, spinning him around. Before the others could react, Bobby had swung the rifle toward a canister attached to his belt, a homemade flashbang device he'd put together years ago for wilderness protection. The explosion wasn't large, but in the enclosed space of the forest, it was disorienting. Bright light and a concussive wave of sound washed over Victor and his men, momentarily stunning them. Bobby used the confusion to break from cover, sprinting along the base of the cliff toward a narrow game trail he'd spotted earlier. Bullets kicked up snow at his heels as Victor recovered, firing blindly in his direction. Bobby pushed himself harder than he had in decades, lungs burning as he scrambled up the steep trail. A white-hot pain lanced through his left arm, a bullet graze. Not serious, but painful enough to make him gasp. The trail opened onto a small plateau, offering no cover except a few stunted pines. Bobby kept moving, knowing that stopping meant death. The plateau narrowed to a natural land bridge spanning a deep gorge, a treacherous crossing in the best of conditions, nearly suicidal in a snowstorm. But Bobby had no choice. Behind him, Victor and his remaining men were gaining ground. He started across the narrow span, the wind buffeting him from all sides. Beneath his feet, the ancient stone was slick with ice, each step a gamble. Halfway across, Bobby risked a glance back. Victor stood at the edge of the land bridge, pistol raised. Their eyes met across the distance, and Bobby saw something like grudging respect in the security chief's gaze. Then Victor fired. The bullet caught Bobby in the side, the impact nearly sending him over the edge. He staggered, dropping to one knee, using the rifle as a support to keep from falling into the abyss below. Blood bloomed across his coat, hot against the frigid air. Victor started across the land bridge, moving carefully but with clear intent. Bobby knew he wouldn't make it to the other side. Not with a bullet in him and his strength fading, but he didn't need to escape. He just needed to buy Kate more time. With the last of his strength, Bobby raised his rifle and fired not at Victor, but at the land bridge itself. The ancient stone, already weakened by centuries of freeze and thaw, couldn't withstand the impact. With a sound like distant thunder, cracks spread across the narrow span. Victor froze, realizing too late what was happening. The bridge gave way beneath him, sending him scrambling backward towards solid ground. Bobby wasn't so fortunate. The section beneath him crumbled, and he felt himself falling, the cold air rushing past him as the gorge opened up to swallow him whole. In his last conscious moment, Bobby Harmon felt something he hadn't experienced in 25 years, the weightlessness of freefall. Not unlike the zero-G simulations he'd helped design for astronauts a lifetime ago. There was a certain poetry to it, he thought, as darkness claimed him. Kate Reynolds had never considered herself particularly athletic, but fear proved to be a remarkable motivator. She followed the frozen creek as Bobby had instructed, moving as quickly as she dared on the treacherous ice. The briefcase felt heavier with each step, its contents a burden more significant than its physical weight. The sound of distant gunfire spurred her on. Bobby was buying her time, and she couldn't waste it. The knowledge that a man she'd met just hours ago was risking his life for the evidence she carried was both humbling and terrifying. After what felt like hours, but was likely less than 40 minutes, Kate spotted the clearing Bobby had described. A tall windmill stood stark against the night sky, its blades motionless in the storm. Beyond it, she could make out the dark shape of a house and several outbuildings. She approached cautiously, aware that this Howard person might not welcome a stranger appearing out of the night. As she neared the house, a security light activated, flooding the yard with harsh illumination. Kate froze, suddenly exposed. The door to the house opened, and a tall, lean figure emerged, shotgun in hand. "That's far enough," a voice called out. "Identify yourself." "My name is Catherine Reynolds," she replied, raising her hands to show she wasn't a threat. "Bobby Harmon sent me. He said to tell you it's a Code Artemis situation." The figure lowered the shotgun slightly. "Where's Bobby?" Kate swallowed hard. "He stayed behind to draw off the men who were following us. Pinnacle Financial Security Team. They're armed and dangerous." The man stepped further into the light, revealing a weathered face with sharp features and calculating eyes. He appeared to be in his early 70s, with a military bearing that time hadn't diminished. "I'm Howard Jenkins," he said, gesturing for her to approach. "Get inside before you freeze to death." The interior of Howard's house was sparse but comfortable, heated by a massive wood stove that radiated blessed warmth. Kate sank into a chair near the fire, her muscles trembling from cold and exertion. "You're bleeding," Howard observed, pointing to a tear in the sleeve of Bobby's coat she wore. Kate glanced down, surprised to see a long gash in her forearm, likely from a branch she'd hit during her flight through the forest. The adrenaline had masked the pain until now. "First aid kit's in the bathroom," Howard said, moving to the window to scan the darkness outside. "Second door on the left. Patch yourself up while I try to reach Bobby on the radio." Kate nodded gratefully and made her way to the bathroom, never letting the briefcase out of her grip. As she cleaned and bandaged the cut longer than she'd initially thought, but not deep, she could hear Howard's voice from the other room, repeating Bobby's name into a radio receiver with increasing urgency. When she returned to the main room, Howard's expression was grim. "No response," he said. "That doesn't necessarily mean anything. Bobby knows better than to use the radio if he thinks they might be monitoring frequencies." Kate sank back into the chair, exhaustion washing over her. "He saved my life. I don't even know why. He doesn't know me. Has no stake in any of this." Howard's mouth twisted into something resembling a smile. "Bobby Harmon spent his entire career trying to save lives. Then when it mattered most, when he tried to warn them about that O-ring design, they shut him down. 7 astronauts died because no one listened." He shook his head. "He's been carrying that weight for 25 years. So yeah, when someone shows up needing help, especially against corporate suits trying to bury the truth, Bobby's going to step up. Kate felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter night. You knew him back then. During his NASA days, we served together before that. Howard replied. Lost touch for a while when he went to NASA, and I stayed in the Air Force. Reconnected well, after everything fell apart for him, I'd retired up here, and when he needed a place to disappear to, I pointed him toward that old property. He studied Kate with narrowed eyes. Now, why don't you tell me what's in that briefcase that's worth killing for? Kate hesitated only briefly before setting the briefcase on the coffee table and entering the combination. Inside was a laptop and several external hard drives, all carefully packed in protective foam. I was the chief compliance officer for Pinnacle Financial Group, she explained, powering up the laptop. 3 months ago, I noticed discrepancies in some of our international transfers. Small things at first, routing numbers that didn't match our established protocols, transfers that bypassed normal compliance checks. Howard leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. Money laundering. On a scale I've never seen before, Kate confirmed. Billions moving through shell companies, offshore accounts, private banking channels in countries with minimal oversight. I started documenting everything, building a case before I took it to the board. The laptop came to life, and Kate entered a complex password. Then last week, I found this. She turned the screen toward Howard, showing him a spreadsheet with thousands of entries. These are payments to and from accounts associated with known terrorist organizations and sanctioned regimes. Pinnacle isn't just laundering money. They're facilitating transactions that directly finance terrorism. Howard whistled softly. And you took this to your superiors. Kate's mouth twisted bitterly. I took it to Charles Montgomery, our CEO. I actually believed he would be as horrified as I was. She shook her head at her own naivety. He thanked me for my diligence, said he'd launch an internal investigation immediately. Then yesterday, I was called to a meeting with HR and our general counsel. They informed me that due to concerning behavior and unfounded accusations, I was being placed on administrative leave pending a psychiatric evaluation. They were setting you up, Howard said, understanding immediately. Discrediting you before you could go public. Exactly. When I returned to my office to collect my things, I found security had already boxed up my personal items. My computer was gone. They'd wiped my email account. Kate's eyes hardened. But they didn't know about the copies I'd been keeping, the external drives I'd been updating daily, or the personal laptop I kept locked in my desk. So you took the evidence and ran, Howard concluded. Kate nodded. I have a friend in Washington, Eleanor Winters. We worked together years ago before she went into politics. She's a senior senator on the banking committee now. If I can get this information to her, she can ensure it reaches the right authorities. People who can't be bought off or threatened into silence. Howard was silent for a long moment, processing everything she'd told him. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the windows. Finally, he stood, moving to a cabinet across the room. You've stepped into something bigger than you realize, he said, unlocking the cabinet to reveal an impressive array of communications equipment. Pinnacle isn't just another financial institution. They've got deep ties to intelligence agencies, defense contractors, half the power brokers in Washington. He began adjusting dials, the equipment humming to life. Getting you to Senator Winters won't be easy, especially with Victor Crane on your trail. You know Crane? Kate asked, surprised. Howard's expression darkened. We've crossed paths. Ex-CIA Special Activities Division. Went private sector about 15 years ago. He's very good at making problems disappear. He finished whatever he was doing with the equipment and turned back to Kate. We need to assume Bobby's been captured or worse. That means we need to move quickly. Where can we go? Kate asked. They found Bobby's place easily enough. What's to stop them from finding us here? Nothing, Howard admitted. But I've got something Bobby doesn't. He gestured for Kate to follow him to a window at the back of the house. Outside, barely visible in the darkness, was the outline of a small airplane in a makeshift hangar. Cessna 182, not fancy, but it'll get us where we need to go. Kate felt a flicker of hope for the first time since she'd fled Pinnacle's offices. You can fly in this weather. It's not ideal, Howard acknowledged, but the storm's moving east. By dawn, we should have a window of clear enough conditions to make it to a small airfield I know in Idaho. From there, we can arrange more secure transportation to Washington. A loud crack from outside interrupted them, the sound of a branch breaking under the weight of snow, or perhaps under the weight of an intruder. Howard immediately killed the lights, moving to the window with practiced stealth. "We've got company," he whispered, gesturing for Kate to stay low. At least 3 figures approaching from the north side of the property. Kate's heart sank. "They must have followed my tracks. I led them straight to you." Howard shook his head. "No time for that now. We need to get to the plane." He retrieved his shotgun and handed Kate a pistol from the cabinet. "There's a tunnel in the cellar that leads to the hangar. It's a tight fit, but it'll keep us out of sight." They moved quickly through the darkened house to the kitchen, where Howard lifted a trap door concealed beneath a rug. The passage below was narrow and clearly hadn't been used in some time, cobwebs brushing against their faces as they descended. "Why does everyone in Montana have secret tunnels under their property?" Kate muttered, ducking to avoid a low-hanging pipe. "Cold War paranoia," Howard replied, echoing Bobby's earlier explanation. "Plus, winters up here can kill you if you're caught outside." Underground passages between buildings made sense to a lot of folks. They emerged into the hangar, where the small Cessna waited like a bird poised for flight. Howard immediately began pre-flight checks while Kate kept watch at a small window, pistol at the ready. "How long until we can take off?" she asked, watching as flashlight beams swept across the yard outside. 15 minutes minimum," Howard replied, his hands moving with practiced efficiency over the aircraft's controls. "We need to let the engine warm up, or we'll never make it off the ground. And I need to open the hangar doors, which will definitely attract attention." Kate glanced at her watch. It had been over an hour since she'd left Bobby in the forest. If he was still alive, still free, he might be making his way here. "We should wait for Bobby." Howard paused, compassion flickering across his weathered features. "Kate, if Bobby could get here, he would have radioed ahead. The fact that he hasn't..." He let the implication hang in the air. Before Kate could respond, the sound of breaking glass came from the main house, followed by muffled shouts. Victor's men had breached the perimeter. "No more time," Howard said grimly. "Help me with these doors." Together, they pushed open the heavy hangar doors, wincing at the screech of metal hinges. Snow swirled in, instantly dropping the temperature in the hangar. Howard climbed into the pilot's seat, motioning for Kate to take the seat beside him. "Buckle up," he instructed, flipping switches and bringing the engine to life. The propeller began to turn, slowly at first, then picking up speed. "It's going to be a rough takeoff." Kate secured her briefcase beneath the seat and fastened her seatbelt, her gaze drawn to the open doorway between the hangar and the tunnel. A part of her still hoped to see Bobby appear, bloodied but alive. Instead, a figure in tactical gear emerged, weapon raised. Kate shouted a warning as the intruder fired, bullets pinging off the Cessna's metal fuselage. Howard gunned the engine, and the small plane lurched forward, out of the hangar and onto the crude runway beyond. More figures appeared, running toward them from the main house. Muzzle flashes lit up the night as they fired at the departing aircraft. Kate ducked instinctively, though the bullets posed little threat now that they were moving. The Cessna picked up speed, bouncing over the rough terrain. For a heart-stopping moment, Kate thought they wouldn't make it. The trees at the end of the runway seemed to be approaching too quickly. Then Howard pulled back on the yoke, and the little plane lifted off, clearing the treetops by what felt like inches. They climbed steeply into the night sky, the storm clouds enveloping them like a shroud. Through a break in the clouds, Kate caught a last glimpse of Howard's property, the house, the hangar, and the dark figures gathered below, growing smaller with each passing second. "We made it," she breathed, hardly daring to believe it. Howard's expression remained grim as he focused on the instruments, guiding the plane through the turbulent air. "For now," he said, "but this is just the beginning. Victor Crane won't stop. Not while you have that evidence." Kate clutched the edge of her seat as the plane bucked in a strong crosswind. "What about Bobby? We just left him behind." Howard was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the first faint light of dawn was beginning to break. "Bobby Harmon is the most resourceful man I've ever known," he said finally. "If anyone could survive a run-in with Crane's men, it's him. But right now, our priority has to be getting that evidence to Washington." Kate nodded, understanding the logic even as guilt gnawed at her conscience. She had involved Bobby in her fight, and now he might be paying the ultimate price for it. The least she could do was ensure his sacrifice wasn't in vain. As the Cessna climbed above the storm clouds into the clear air beyond, Kate opened her laptop once more. She needed to review the evidence, make sure it was organized in a way that would be immediately comprehensible to Senator Winters. There could be no ambiguity, no room for doubt. The files opened in sequence transaction records, account details, internal communications that had been scrubbed from Pinnacle's official servers. Kate had been thorough in her documentation, her years of compliance work evident in the meticulous organization. But as she scrolled through a folder of executive emails, something caught her eye, a name she hadn't noticed before, referenced in a coded exchange between Charles Montgomery and several board members. "Project Artemis," she murmured, the hairs on the back of her neck rising. "That's the code word Bobby told me to use with Howard." Howard's hands tightened on the controls. "What did you say?" Kate turned the laptop toward him. "There's something here about a Project Artemis. It's the same code word Bobby told me to use when I reached your place." Howard's face had gone pale. "That's impossible. Artemis was a classified NASA initiative from the 1980s. Bobby and I worked on it briefly before he moved to the shuttle program. It was scrapped after budget cuts." "Well, it appears Pinnacle Financial has revived the name," Kate said, scanning the emails. "There are references to Artemis protocols and Artemis assets, all in communications from the last 6 months." Howard banked the plane gently, putting them on a southeasterly heading. "I need to see those emails. All of them." For the next hour, as the sun rose fully above the horizon, Kate and Howard combed through the Artemis communications. What they found left them both shaken. "They're using the original Artemis research," Howard said, his voice tight with anger. "Military applications of spacecraft technology that we developed for defense purposes, but that Bobby argued were too dangerous to pursue. The program was officially terminated, all the research supposedly destroyed." "But someone kept copies," Kate surmised. "And now Pinnacle is funding a revival of the program through these black market transactions?" Howard nodded grimly. "Not just funding it. According to these communications, they've built a working prototype based on Bobby's original designs he deliberately sabotaged before submitting his final reports because he believed the technology was too volatile." Kate felt cold despite the warm air blowing from the plane's heaters. "So this isn't just about money laundering or financing terrorism. It's about weapons development." "Worse," Howard replied. "It's about selling advanced weapons technology to the highest bidder, and if these specs are accurate, we're talking about something that could destabilize the global balance of power." The implications were staggering. What had begun as a financial compliance issue had spiraled into something with potential national security ramifications. No wonder Victor Crane and his team had been so determined to recover the data. "We need to get this to Senator Winters immediately," Kate said, saving and backing up the files to yet another drive. "And we need to find out what happened to Bobby. If Pinnacle realizes he's the original designer of this technology—" Howard nodded, understanding her concern. "They'll either try to recruit him or eliminate him as a threat. Either way, we're racing against the clock." He adjusted their course slightly, eyeing the fuel gauge. "We've got enough to make it to the airfield in Idaho, but it'll be close. And we have to assume Crane has already alerted every private airfield in a 300-mile radius to watch for us. Kate stared out at the vast wilderness below them, the snow-covered landscape stretching to the horizon. Somewhere down there, Bobby Harmon was either fighting for his life or already beyond help. A man she had known for less than a day, who had risked everything to help her without hesitation. "We'll find him," Howard said, as if reading her thoughts. "Bobby's survived worse, but first, we need to make sure his sacrifice wasn't for nothing." The Cessna continued its journey southeast, a tiny speck against the immense blue sky. Behind them, the storm clouds that had sheltered them from pursuit were beginning to dissipate, leaving them exposed not just to the sun's rays, but to the watchful eyes of those who would stop at nothing to recover what Kate carried. And somewhere far below, in a snow-filled gorge, a figure stirred beneath a blanket of white, broken, bleeding, but somehow still alive. Bobby Harmon opened his eyes to a world of pain and blinding brightness, his survival instincts already calculating his next move. The game wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. Bobby Harmon should have been dead. The fall into the gorge would have killed most men, especially those half his age. Yet consciousness returned to him in stuttering fragments. First pain, sharp and all-encompassing. Then the bitter cold, and finally the realization that he was somehow still breathing. He lay motionless in the snow, assessing his situation with the methodical precision that had once made him one of NASA's most valued engineers. The pain radiating from his left side suggested at least 2 broken ribs. His left shoulder was dislocated, and the bullet wound, while not immediately life-threatening, had left him weak from blood loss. The snow beneath him was stained crimson, but the cold had actually worked in his favor, slowing the bleeding. Carefully, Bobby turned his head to survey his surroundings. The gorge was deep but narrower than it had appeared from above. He had fallen perhaps 40 feet before landing on a snow-covered ledge that had broken his descent. Below the ledge was another drop, this one surely fatal. The land bridge he had destroyed was now a jagged ruin, sections of it scattered across the gorge floor. There was no sign of Victor or his men. They had likely assumed the fall had killed him, a reasonable assumption under the circumstances. That gave Bobby a slim advantage, but one that would quickly evaporate if he didn't find shelter and medical attention. With gritted teeth, Bobby pushed himself into a sitting position. The world spun alarmingly, and for a moment, he thought he might pass out again. He forced himself to breathe slowly, counting each inhale and exhale as he had been taught during astronaut training sessions he had helped design decades ago. Once the dizziness subsided, he took stock of his resources. His rifle was gone, lost in the fall, but his hunting knife was still sheathed at his belt. The backpack had survived as well, though some of its contents had spilled out. He still had a first aid kit, a flashlight, some beef jerky, and a metal canteen of water that had miraculously remained intact. First priority: stop the bleeding. Bobby unzipped his coat with trembling fingers and examined the bullet wound. The round had passed through his side, leaving an entry and exit wound, but apparently missing vital organs. Small mercies. He used gauze from the first aid kit to create pressure bandages, biting back groans of pain as he secured them with medical tape. Next, the dislocated shoulder. This would be the worst part. Bobby positioned himself against the rock wall of the gorge, taking several deep breaths to prepare. Then, with a sudden movement, he slammed his shoulder against the unyielding stone. A white-hot lance of agony tore through him, but he felt the joint pop back into place. He couldn't stifle the scream that escaped his lips, the sound echoing off the gorge walls before being swallowed by the vastness of the Montana wilderness. For several minutes, Bobby simply sat there, breathing hard, waiting for the pain to subside to manageable levels. His breath formed thick clouds in the frigid air. The temperature was dropping as evening approached, and he knew he couldn't remain exposed overnight. Hypothermia would claim him long before his injuries did. With painful slowness, Bobby began to examine the ledge on which he had landed. It extended about 20 feet in either direction before tapering off. At the far end, partially concealed by a snowdrift, was what appeared to be a small opening in the rock face, perhaps a cave, or at least a shallow depression that might offer some protection from the elements. It took him nearly 15 minutes to cover the short distance, each movement sending fresh waves of pain through his battered body. The opening was indeed a cave, not particularly deep, but enough to shield him from the wind and snow. Inside, the temperature was marginally warmer, though still well below freezing. Bobby collapsed against the rear wall, exhaustion threatening to overwhelm him. He allowed himself 5 minutes of rest, no more, no less, before forcing himself back into action. From the backpack, he retrieved a small emergency thermal blanket, unfolding it with clumsy fingers and wrapping it around his shoulders. Next came the beef jerky, which he forced himself to chew slowly, despite his body's demand for immediate sustenance. As he ate, Bobby's mind turned to Kate Reynolds and the evidence she carried. Had she made it to Howard's? Were they already airborne, racing toward Washington and the safety that Senator Winters might provide? Or had Victor's men captured her, retrieving the damning information that threatened Pinnacle Financial's criminal empire? There was no way to know, and the uncertainty gnawed at him. Bobby had spent 25 years in self-imposed exile, avoiding confrontation, keeping his head down. Then, in the space of a single night, he had thrown himself back into the fray, risking everything for a stranger and a cause that wasn't his. Or was it? The more he thought about it, the more Bobby recognized that this fight was indeed his, had always been his. The same corporate machinery that had crushed him when he tried to prevent the shuttle disaster was at work here, powerful interests placing profit and convenience above human lives, silencing those who dared to speak truth to power. Maybe this was his second chance. Maybe Kate would succeed where he had failed, exposing the corruption that festered beneath the polished veneer of institutions that were supposed to serve the public good. And if his sacrifice helped make that possible, then perhaps the last 25 years hadn't been wasted after all. Night fell completely, plunging the cave into absolute darkness. Bobby activated the flashlight, its beam casting eerie shadows on the rough stone walls. Using the last of his strength, he gathered what dry debris he could find: twigs, leaves, a few fragments of a bird's nest, and attempted to build a small fire. His hands were shaking too badly from cold and blood loss to work the matches effectively, but after several frustrated attempts, a tiny flame caught. The fire was pathetically small, more smoke than heat, but it was something. Bobby huddled close, extending his hands toward the meager warmth. He knew he needed to stay awake. Sleep in his condition, with the ambient temperature still dropping, could be fatal, but exhaustion was a powerful adversary, and Bobby found his eyelids growing heavier by the minute. To keep himself alert, he began to recite the complex mathematical formulas he had once used daily: thrust-to-weight ratios, orbital mechanics, stress tolerances. The numbers flowed through his mind, offering a familiar comfort. When those were exhausted, he moved on to reciting the names of every colleague he could remember from his NASA days, from the senior engineers to the janitors who had kept the facilities running smoothly. As the night dragged on, Bobby found himself thinking of Kate again, wondering what had drawn her to the compliance field in the first place. She struck him as someone with a strong moral compass, unwilling to look the other way when confronted with wrongdoing. In that, they were kindred spirits, though their paths had taken very different trajectories. The tiny fire sputtered and died despite Bobby's efforts to maintain it. Darkness closed in again, and with it came a bone-deep weariness that he couldn't fight any longer. His last conscious thought was a silent apology to Kate for not being able to see this through to the end. Dawn broke over the small Idaho airfield, painting the snow-covered runway in shades of pink and gold. Howard Jenkins guided the Cessna down with expert precision, the landing gear touching down with just a slight bounce before the small aircraft rolled to a stop near a cluster of hangars. "We made it," Kate breathed, releasing her white-knuckled grip on the edge of her seat. The flight had been turbulent, the small plane buffeted by crosswinds that had tested even Howard's considerable skills as a pilot. "Don't celebrate yet," Howard cautioned, shutting down the engine. "This is just a refueling stop. We're still a long way from Washington. Kate scanned the airfield through the frost-rimmed window. It was a modest facility, a single runway, a few hangars, and a small control tower that looked like it had been built in the 1950s. A sign hanging askew from the nearest building read, Porter County Regional Airfield. Doesn't look like much, she observed. That's the point, Howard replied, unbuckling his harness. Small enough to be off the radar, but still equipped to handle refueling. The manager's an old Air Force buddy. Should be able to help us out without asking too many questions. They exited the aircraft, the cold morning air cutting through Kate's borrowed coat. Her muscles protested after hours confined in the small cockpit, and the wound on her arm throbbed dully beneath its bandage. But these discomforts seemed trivial compared to what Bobby might be enduring if he was even still alive. Howard led the way to a weather-beaten building that served as the airfield's office. Inside, an elderly man with a shock of white hair looked up from a dog-eared aviation magazine, his rheumy eyes widening in recognition. "Jenkins, you old buzzard," he exclaimed, rising from his chair with surprising agility. "Thought you'd retired to that mountain hideaway for good." "Ah, things change, Bill," Howard replied, clasping the man's outstretched hand. "Need a quick refuel and maybe some breakfast if you got it." Bill's gaze shifted to Kate, curiosity evident in his expression. "The cafe across the street makes a decent omelet. I'll handle the refuel while you two get some food." He lowered his voice. "Anything I should know about you've got that look, same as back in '75 when we had to extract that asset from Laos." Howard's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. "The less you know, the better. But we were never here." "Understood." Bill nodded. "No further explanation necessary. Give me 30 minutes on the refuel. Take an hour for breakfast if you want. Weather's clear all the way to the Mississippi from what I'm hearing." Howard thanked him, and they crossed the quiet street to a small diner with a flickering, open sign in the window. The place was nearly empty at this hour, just a couple of truckers nursing coffee at the counter. A sleepy-eyed waitress showed them to a booth in the corner, away from the windows. "What's our next move?" Kate asked once they had ordered coffee and food. "Even with a refueled plane, we're still a long way from Washington." Howard leaned back, his weathered face showing the strain of the past 12 hours. "We can't fly directly there. Too obvious. Crane will have people watching all the major airports within range of DC. So we land somewhere else and drive the rest of the way. That's the plan. There's a private airstrip in western Pennsylvania owned by another old contact. From there, it's about a 4-hour drive to Washington." Kate nodded, processing this information. "And if Victor's people are watching that airstrip too?" "Then we improvise," Howard said with a shrug that didn't quite mask his concern. "One advantage we have is that they're probably looking for a man and a woman traveling together. We can split up if necessary, approach from different directions." The waitress returned with their coffee, and Kate wrapped her hands around the mug, savoring the warmth. "What about Bobby? We can't just leave him out there." Howard's expression softened. "I've got some contacts in the area who can start looking quietly. But you have to understand our priority has to be getting that evidence to Senator Winters. It's what Bobby would want." Kate knew he was right, but the guilt remained. "I still don't understand why he helped me. He didn't know me, didn't owe me anything." "Bobby Harmon is a man who's been waiting 25 years for a chance to redeem himself," Howard replied, his voice low. "When the shuttle disaster happened, it confirmed his worst fears. 7 people died because no one listened to him. He's been carrying that weight ever since." "So I was his shot at redemption?" Kate asked, not entirely comfortable with the idea. Howard shook his head. "It's not that simple. Bobby saw in you someone willing to risk everything to expose the truth. That resonated with him in a way nothing has since NASA." He paused, taking a sip of coffee. "And there's something else you should know. The company that originally buried Bobby's O-ring report, they were acquired by Meridian Aerospace in 1989, which later became part of a conglomerate called TechCore Industries." Kate's eyes widened in recognition. Which was purchased by Pinnacle Financial in 2004 during their expansion into the defense sector. Exactly. The same people who ruined Bobby's career, who ignored his warnings and let those astronauts die, are now running Pinnacle Financial. I doubt he made the connection immediately, but on some level, I think he recognized the pattern. Their food arrived omelets, toast, and a side of hash browns that smelled heavenly after hours of stress and fear. They ate quickly, aware that each minute spent stationary increased the risk of discovery. Kate was halfway through her meal when the diner's door opened, admitting a blast of cold air and a man in a sheriff's uniform. Howard tensed almost imperceptibly, his hand drifting toward the inside of his jacket where Kate knew he kept a pistol. The sheriff nodded to the waitress and took a seat at the counter, apparently just making a routine stop for coffee. Howard relaxed slightly but kept the lawman in his peripheral vision. "We should go," he murmured, laying down enough cash to cover their bill and a generous tip. Bills should be done with the refuel by now. They had just risen from their seats when the sheriff's radio crackled to life. Kate couldn't make out the words, but the officer's response was clear enough. "Roger that. I'm at Maggie's Diner now. We'll keep an eye out for a male and female matching that description. Cessna 182, you said." Howard grabbed Kate's arm, steering her toward the rear of the diner. "Kitchen exit," he whispered urgently. "Now!" They pushed through the swinging doors into the diner's small kitchen, startling a cook who was preparing the day's soup. Howard flashed a badge that Kate hadn't seen before it looked official enough to make the cook step aside without question. "Federal agents," Howard explained tersely. "Need to use your back door." The cook pointed wordlessly to a metal door at the rear of the kitchen. Howard pushed it open, checking the alley beyond before pulling Kate through. The bitter cold hit them again as they emerged into a narrow passage behind the row of small businesses. "What now?" Kate gasped, clutching her briefcase close. "They know about the plane. We need alternate transportation," Howard replied, already moving toward the far end of the alley. "And we need it fast." They emerged onto a side street, quickly crossing to another block where several vehicles were parked outside a small motel. Howard surveyed them critically before settling on an older model pickup truck with Montana plates. "Wait here," he instructed, approaching the truck with the casual confidence of someone who belonged there. Kate watched in disbelief as he produced a set of tools from his pocket and had the door open in seconds. Another minute of work under the dashboard, and the engine rumbled to life. "Get in," Howard called, sliding behind the wheel. "We don't have much time." Kate hesitated only briefly before climbing into the passenger seat. "We're stealing a truck. What happened to being federal agents?" "I never said which government I worked for," Howard replied with a grim smile, pulling away from the curb. "Or when I stopped working for them." They drove through the small town at a deliberately casual pace, avoiding the main street where the sheriff might spot them. Howard took a circuitous route that eventually brought them to a state highway heading east. "What about the plane?" Kate asked, glancing behind them, half expecting to see flashing lights in pursuit. "Won't they track us through it?" "Bill will tell them we left hours ago, headed in the wrong direction," Howard assured her, "and the registration on the Cessna leads to a shell corporation that would take them days to unravel. By then, we'll be in Washington." Kate's shoulders slumped in relief, the adrenaline that had been sustaining her beginning to ebb. "This is insane. 2 days ago, I was a corporate executive with a corner office. Now I'm a fugitive stealing trucks with an ex-spy." "Ex-Air Force," Howard corrected, "though I did work with intelligence services occasionally after my official retirement." He glanced at her with something like sympathy. "For what it's worth, you're holding up better than most civilians would in your situation." "Thanks. I think, what do you want?" Kate turned her attention to the landscape rushing past rolling hills covered in snow, occasional farmhouses with smoke rising from chimneys, a world that seemed impossibly normal compared to the chaos of the past 24 hours. "How long to Pennsylvania?" Howard checked the fuel gauge. "In this truck about 12 hours if we push it, but we'll need to stop for gas at least twice, and we should change vehicles again before crossing state lines." Kate nodded, trying to process the reality of their situation. And assuming we make it to Washington, what then? We just walk into Senator Winter's office with a briefcase full of evidence against one of the most powerful financial institutions in the country. That's the general idea, Howard confirmed. Though I'd suggest calling ahead once we're close. Winters will want to be prepared. Maybe have some trusted staff on hand. The mention of phones reminded Kate of a potential vulnerability. My cell phone, I left it at Pinnacle when I fled, but they might be able to track yours if you've used it recently. Howard shook his head. I don't carry traceable phones, but you're right to be cautious. We'll use burner phones, purchased with cash. When we need to make contact with Winters, they fell into silence, each lost in their own thoughts as the miles rolled by. Kate found herself drifting in and out of an exhausted half-sleep, jerking awake whenever the truck hit a rough patch of road. During one such moment of wakefulness, a new thought occurred to her. Howard, those Artemis files we found, what exactly was the original project about Bobby? Never explained the details. Howard's hands tightened on the steering wheel. It was a classified defense initiative, started during the Reagan administration. The goal was to develop a satellite system capable of neutralizing intercontinental ballistic missiles, part of the Strategic Defense Initiative, what the media called Star Wars. That doesn't sound particularly controversial, Kate observed, at least not by Cold War standards. The baseline concept wasn't, Howard agreed, but Bobby's team was working on a more advanced application, a system that could not only intercept missiles, but could be adapted to target any object in orbit or on the ground with pinpoint accuracy. Essentially, a space-based weapon that could strike anywhere on Earth within minutes, with no defense possible. Kate felt a chill that had nothing to do with the truck's inadequate heater. And Bobby opposed this vehemently. He argued that such a system violated the spirit of international treaties prohibiting weapons in space. More practically, he pointed out that the technology could be catastrophic if it ever fell into the wrong hands or malfunctioned. He deliberately introduced flaws into his final designs before submitting them, ensuring the system would fail if anyone tried to build it as specified. But someone at Pinnacle has found a way around those flaws, Kate surmised. Howard nodded grimly. According to the emails you uncovered, they've not only solved the problems Bobby introduced, but have enhanced the original design. If they've actually built a working prototype, then they have a weapon that could destabilize global security. Kate finished, the full implications becoming clear. And they're planning to sell it to the highest bidder, using the laundered money to finance the operation? Which explains why they're so desperate to recover your evidence, Howard said. This goes way beyond financial crimes. It's potential treason. The revelation settled over them like a heavy blanket. Kate found herself wondering if she had stumbled onto something far more dangerous than she'd initially realized. The stakes weren't just about corporate malfeasance anymore. They were about national security, perhaps even global stability. Hours passed as they continued eastward, stopping only for fuel and to switch vehicles at a used car lot where Howard somehow managed to trade the stolen truck for an equally nondescript sedan without paperwork or questions. Kate didn't ask how. She was beginning to understand that Howard Jenkins had resources and connections that defied conventional explanation. As afternoon faded into evening, they crossed into Minnesota, the landscape flattening into snow-covered plains, occasionally broken by small towns that appeared and disappeared in the gathering darkness. Howard drove with mechanical precision, never exceeding the speed limit, signaling every turn with textbook correctness, the perfect anonymous traveler. Kate was dozing again when a news alert chimed on the radio, jerking her back to full consciousness. Hulaitin. Unconfirmed reports of a confrontation between private security personnel and federal agents near the Montana-Idaho border, the announcer was saying. Sources indicate that the incident may be related to an ongoing investigation into financial irregularities at Pinnacle Financial Group. A spokesperson for Pinnacle has denied any connection, stating that the company is cooperating fully with authorities. In other news, Howard switched off the radio, his expression thoughtful. They're trying to control the narrative. painting themselves as the cooperative corporate citizens while portraying us as criminals. But they mentioned federal agents, Kate pointed out. Does that mean actual authorities are involved now? Hard to say. Could be a fabrication to legitimize Crane's operation, or it could mean Pinnacle has enough influence to get federal resources committed to the search. Howard's mouth set in a grim line. Either way, it complicates things. Kate leaned her head against the cool glass of the window, watching the hypnotic flow of headlights from oncoming traffic. What about Bobby? If there was a confrontation, he might have been involved, or he might be long gone, Howard replied, though his tone lacked conviction. Bobby knows those mountains better than anyone. If he survived the initial encounter, he could have gone to ground. The if hung in the air between them, a stark acknowledgement of the dangers Bobby had faced. Kate found herself hoping desperately that the crusty old mechanic had somehow escaped, that his sacrifice hadn't been final. Get some proper sleep, Howard advised, noting her exhaustion. I'll wake you when we need to switch drivers. Kate wanted to protest that she was fine, that she could stay alert, but the events of the past 2 days had drained her completely. Within minutes of closing her eyes, she was asleep. Consciousness returned to Bobby like a reluctant visitor grudgingly, and with considerable protest. His first sensation was not pain, as he had expected, but warmth. Actual, blessed warmth that seemed to envelop him like a cocoon. He opened his eyes to find himself in an unfamiliar room, lying on a narrow bed beneath several layers of thick quilts. A wood stove crackled in the corner, radiating heat that made the small space almost uncomfortably warm after the frigid conditions of the cave. Memories flooded back the fall, his injuries, the long night in the gorge. By all rights, he should be dead, frozen solid in that remote crevice. The fact that he wasn't suggested either a miracle or human intervention. Awake at last, a voice observed from the doorway. Was beginning to think you might sleep straight through to spring. Bobby turned his head, wincing at the stiffness in his neck, to see a woman in her early 60s standing in the doorway. She was tall and lean, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a practical braid. Her face was weathered by years outdoors, lines of experience etched around eyes that studied him with frank curiosity. "Where?" Bobby began, his voice a raspy croak. "My cabin," the woman replied, approaching with a glass of water. "About 3 miles east of where I found you. You're lucky I was checking my trap lines yesterday. Another few hours in that cave, and you'd have been beyond saving." Bobby accepted the water gratefully, taking small sips as the woman had instructed with a gesture. Now that he was more alert, he noticed she moved with the precise economy of someone accustomed to wilderness living. Her clothes were practical, heavy canvas pants, a flannel shirt, sturdy boots, but not without a certain style. "My name's Marion Blackwood," she continued, pulling a chair beside the bed. "I'd ask yours, but I already found your ID while patching you up." "Robert Harmon, age 68, resident of Bear Creek, Montana." She tilted her head slightly. "What I haven't figured out is why a mechanic from Bear Creek ended up half dead in a gorge with a bullet wound and enough injuries to suggest you fell from a considerable height." Bobby set the empty glass aside, considering how much to reveal. Marion Blackwood had clearly saved his life, which suggested she wasn't working with Victor Crane. But caution had become second nature after 25 years of self-imposed exile. "It's complicated," he finally said. Marion's mouth quirked in what might have been amusement. "I gathered that much from the bullet hole. Most complicated situations I know of involve people shooting at each other." She leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. "Look, I'm not asking for your life story, but if someone's hunting you, I'd like to know. Self-preservation and all that?" Bobby conceded the point with a nod. "Fair enough. Short version, I help someone who's in trouble with some very dangerous people. Corporate security types with military training and a lot of firepower. They tracked us to my place. We split up, and I led some of them away to give her a chance to escape." Marion raised an eyebrow. "A woman named Catherine Reynolds. She uncovered some illegal activities at the company she worked for and took evidence with her when she left. I was helping her get to a friend's place where she might arrange safer transportation. Marion absorbed this information with an inscrutable expression. And did she make it? This Catherine. I don't know, Bobby admitted, the uncertainty gnawing at him. I hope so. Last I saw her, she was heading toward Howard Jenkins' property. He has a plane. Might have been able to fly her out. Howard Jenkins, Marion repeated, recognition flickering in her eyes. The old Air Force pilot with the place near Whitefish Lake, I know him, or knew him years back. Bobby's interest sharpened. You know Howard. Our paths crossed occasionally. I used to work for the Forest Service, managed this whole region for almost 2 decades. Howard would sometimes fly survey missions for us during fire season. Marion stood, moving to add another log to the already roaring fire. Small world, I suppose. The coincidence seemed too convenient to be mere chance, and Bobby's natural caution reasserted itself. How exactly did you find me in that gorge? It's pretty remote terrain. Marion turned back to face him, apparently untroubled by the implicit suspicion in his question. Like I said, I was checking my trap lines. I run a small guide service these days, take hunters and nature photographers into the backcountry. Trapping helps supplement the income during the off-season. She gestured toward the window, where light was beginning to fade. I heard what sounded like an explosion yesterday morning, followed by gunfire. Went to investigate and found what was left of that land bridge. Spotted signs of blood on the snow and followed the trail to the cave where you were holed up. It was a plausible explanation, and Bobby's instincts weren't raising any immediate alarms. Still, the timing was remarkable. I've been living in these mountains for 30 years. Mr. Harmon, Marion continued, apparently reading his thoughts. Not much happens in my territory that I don't know about. When I heard a convoy of vehicles heading toward your property night before last, I took notice. That many engines in the dead of winter, in the middle of nowhere. Something was up, she shrugged. I kept my distance, but I was curious enough to do some reconnoitering the next day. Lucky for you, I did. Bobby relaxed slightly, the explanation fitting with what he knew of the close-knit mountain communities where neighbors might be miles apart but still kept tabs on unusual activities. Thank you, he said simply. For finding me, he gestured at the bandages visible beneath the quilt. All of this, Marion waved away his gratitude. I was a field medic before joining the Forest Service. Old habits die hard. She moved toward the door. You should rest more. Those ribs need time to heal, and you lost a lot of blood. I'll bring some soup in a bit. After she left, Bobby took stock of his condition more thoroughly. His ribs were tightly bound. The bullet wound had been properly cleaned and dressed, and his dislocated shoulder had been expertly reset and immobilized. Marion Blackwood clearly knew what she was doing. The room itself was small but well-appointed, a single bed, a nightstand, a dresser, and a small bookshelf filled with well-worn paperbacks. The walls were decorated with what appeared to be hand-drawn maps of the surrounding wilderness and a few framed photographs of mountain vistas. Bobby's gaze was drawn to a radio on the nightstand, an expensive model capable of receiving transmissions across multiple frequencies. If he could reach Howard, he might learn whether Kate had made it safely away. He was about to attempt getting out of bed when Marion returned carrying a tray with a steaming bowl of soup and what appeared to be homemade bread. She set it on the nightstand and fixed him with a stern look. Don't even think about getting up yet, she warned. You've got 3 broken ribs, a gunshot wound, and enough bruising to suggest you should be dead. The only reason you're not is that the cold slowed your bleeding and the snow cushioned your fall somewhat. Bobby subsided, recognizing the futility of argument. I need to find out if Kate made it to Howard's. If she's safe, Marion's expression softened slightly. I can help with that. I've got a radio powerful enough to reach Howard's place, assuming he's monitoring the usual frequencies. Hope flared in Bobby's chest. You'd do that after I make sure you eat something? Marion replied, placing the tray across his lap. No point in saving your life just to let you starve to death. The soup was rich venison stew, hearty and flavorful. Bobby hadn't realized how hungry he was until the first spoonful hit his tongue. He ate with single-minded focus, aware of Marion watching him with something between amusement and approval. When he had finished, she took the tray and brought the radio to his bedside, adjusting it to a frequency that Bobby recognized as one Howard sometimes used for secure communications. "Howard Jenkins, this is Marion Blackwood," she spoke into the microphone. "Do you copy over?" Static answered her, broken occasionally by fragments of other transmissions' weather reports. Truckers complaining about road conditions, the usual chatter of the airwaves. Marion tried again, switching to another frequency. "Howard Jenkins, come in. This is Marion Blackwood with a message regarding Bobby Harmon. Do you copy over?" More static. Then suddenly a voice broke through, distorted but recognizable. "Marion, this is Howard. Authenticate with today's wildlife report. Over." Marion smiled slightly. "3 eagles over Whitefish Lake. Moose tracks near Cameron Creek. Over." "Authentication accepted," Howard's voice replied, clearer now. "Did you say Bobby Harmon over?" "Affirmative. He's alive, recovering at my cabin. Gunshot wound and broken ribs, but stable. Over." There was a pause, then Howard's voice returned, relief evident even through the static. "That's the best news I've had in days. Is he able to speak over?" Marion handed the microphone to Bobby, who took it with shaking hands. "Howard, it's Bobby. Did Kate make it to you? Is she safe over?" "Bobby, thank God," Howard replied. "Yes, Kate made it. We're currently en route to Washington via ground transportation. Estimated arrival tomorrow evening." "Over." Bobby closed his eyes briefly, the tension draining from his shoulders. "Any pursuit over?" "We had some trouble at a refueling stop in Idaho. Changed vehicles and are proceeding with caution. No sign of immediate pursuit, but we're assuming Crane is coordinating a multi-state search." "Over." "What about the evidence over?" "Intact and more significant than we initially understood. Kate found references to Project Artemis in Pinnacle's communications. They've apparently revived the program. Bobby, using your original designs." "Over." Bobby felt as though he'd been punched in the stomach, the breath leaving his lungs in a rush. Project Artemis, his greatest professional regret. A weapons system he had helped design before realizing its terrible potential and sabotaging his own work to ensure it could never be fully implemented. "That's not possible," he replied, voice hoarse with shock. "I destroyed the viable elements of that design, made sure it couldn't be reconstructed." "Over." "Apparently someone kept copies," Howard said grimly. "And they found workarounds for your sabotage. According to the files Kate recovered, they've built a working prototype." "Over." The implications were staggering. Project Artemis, if successfully completed, would represent a paradigm shift in military technology, a space-based weapons platform capable of targeting any point on Earth with devastating precision, immune to conventional countermeasures. In the wrong hands, it could destabilize the global balance of power overnight. "Howard, you need to get that evidence to Washington as quickly as possible," Bobby urged. "This goes beyond financial crimes. It's a matter of national security." "Over." "We're proceeding as fast as we safely can," Howard assured him. "But there's something else you should know. According to radio reports, Pinnacle is claiming that Kate stole proprietary technology information. They've apparently convinced some federal agencies to join the search, portraying her as an industrial spy rather than a whistleblower." "Over," Bobby cursed under his breath. "They're trying to control the narrative. If they can paint Kate as the criminal, any evidence she presents will be tainted." "Over?" "Exactly. Which is why we need to reach Senator Winters before they can close that net. She has the connections to ensure the evidence reaches the right people. People who can't be bought off or intimidated." "Over." Bobby glanced at Marion, who was listening to the exchange with undisguised interest. "What's your status on supplies and transportation over?" "We're adequately supplied and have changed vehicles twice to avoid tracking. Current ETA in Washington is approximately 1,800 hours tomorrow. Assuming no further complications. Over. Good, I'll recover here. Then attempt to rendezvous if possible. Marion has medical training and seems to know what she's doing. Over. Howard's chuckle crackled through the static. If it's the Marion Blackwood I remember, she definitely knows what she's doing. Former Special Forces medic before she joined the Forest Service. You're in good hands. Over. Bobby raised an eyebrow at Marion, who shrugged unapologetically. I simplified my resume earlier. Force of habit. Howard, maintain radio silence unless absolutely necessary, Bobby continued. And watch your backs. Crane isn't the type to give up easily. Over. Understood. Take care of yourself. Old friend. Jenkins out. The radio fell silent, and Bobby handed the microphone back to Marion, his mind racing with the implications of what he'd learned. Project Artemis, resurrected after all these years. His worst fears potentially coming to fruition. Special Forces? Huh, he said finally, focusing on the one element of the conversation that seemed safest to address. Marion set the radio aside with a half smile. 107th Medical Battalion, attached to various units that officially didn't exist in places we officially never went. Ancient history now. Why the Forest Service afterward? Needed the quiet, she replied simply. Too many ghosts. The forest doesn't ask questions or expect explanations. She studied him thoughtfully. Sounds like you might understand something about that. Bobby nodded, recognizing the kinship of souls who had seen too much and sought solace in isolation. This Project Artemis Howard mentioned it was classified weapons research from the 1980s, something I helped design before I realized what it could become. I deliberately sabotaged my own work to ensure it couldn't be built as specified. And now someone's fixed your sabotage, Marion surmised. Apparently, if they've truly built a working prototype, Bobby didn't finish the thought. He didn't need to. Marion was silent for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she rose, moving to a locked cabinet in the corner of the room. From it, she retrieved a satellite phone, an expensive model that Bobby recognized as military-grade equipment. I don't know exactly what you're involved in, she said, setting the phone on the nightstand. But if it's as serious as it sounds, you might need more secure communications than a radio. This is untraceable, operates on encrypted channels, batteries fully charged. Bobby stared at the device, then at Marion. That's not standard Forest Service issue. She smiled, a genuine expression that softened the hard edges of her face. Let's just say I maintained certain connections after I left the service. Old habits. Like I said, the gesture of trust wasn't lost on Bobby. By providing the phone, Marion was not only offering practical assistance, but also signaling her willingness to be involved, to be part of whatever was unfolding. Thank you, he said, the words inadequate but heartfelt. Marion nodded once, acknowledging both his gratitude and the unspoken alliance it represented. Rest now. Tomorrow. We can discuss next steps. If your friends are heading to Washington, they may need backup when they arrive. As she left the room, closing the door softly behind her, Bobby felt a curious sense of purpose settling over him. 25 years ago, he had retreated from the world, licking his wounds in solitary exile. Now, through a series of improbable events, he found himself thrust back into a fight that echoed his past failures, but this time, perhaps, with a chance at redemption. Kate and Howard were racing against time, and a formidable adversary to deliver evidence that could expose not just financial crimes, but a potential threat to global security. Bobby might be injured, might be thousands of miles from Washington, but he wasn't out of the fight yet, not by a long shot. They say the measure of courage isn't found in grand gestures, but in the quiet moments when nobody's watching, like an aging mechanic offering shelter during a storm, or a whistleblower clutching a thumb drive worth more than his life. The presidential medal now hangs in Henry's workshop, gathering dust beside wrenches and socket sets. Some days he forgets it's there. Other days he catches its gleam in morning light and remembers the cost. Eleanor's bruised face, Pastor Jim's congregation standing guard outside their church for weeks. The names of those who didn't survive Operation Blackwater etched in granite at the new memorial. Truth extracted its price from them all, but so had silence, for 30 long years. From his porch on Pembroke Farm, Henry watches the sunset with Eleanor's hand in his, two battle-scarred souls finding peace in second chances. In Cedar Grove, children play in yards where once they couldn't breathe without pain. In Washington, Michael still fights, making sure the system remembers its debt to the forgotten. Perhaps that's the truest legacy of their journey, not medals or headlines, but the simple reminder that ordinary hands can still bend the arc of justice, even when the powerful would prefer we look away. What might we accomplish if we refuse to stay silent, just once, when it mattered most?